January 1948. Cold morning on Riverside Drive. An old man stands at his apartment window, watching a wrecking ball hang motionless before the largest private house New York has ever seen. 75 rooms, French towers reaching toward grey winter sky, the Schwab mansion, waiting for execution. The first blow lands. Stone dust explodes where stained glass once filtered afternoon light. The Sound rolls across the Hudson River, a deep crack that splits not just masonry, but an entire era of American ambition. Below, a small crowd gathers. They whisper about the man who built this place, who died nearly broke just years earlier, about how the city never loved his dream. This story doesn't begin with destruction. It begins with hunger. Charles Schwab grew up in Pennsylvania coal country. Smoke and noise, blast furnaces pounding through the night. He watched men disappear into blackened mills at dawn and decided he would never be small again. The mansion he'd built wasn't simply a house. It was a declaration. Proof that a Catholic boy from nowhere could stand among Fifth Avenue's Protestant aristocracy. Could surpass them. When Schwab purchased an entire city block between 73rd and 74th Streets on Riverside Drive, old money families watched with barely concealed disgust. Everyone knew the right address was Fifth Avenue. Riverside Drive was the wrong side of Central Park, the view side, not the status side. Schwab didn't care. He hired architect Maurice Hebert with one instruction: build something that makes Andrew Carnegie's mansion look modest. Between 1902 and 1906, workers transformed the site. They imported pink granite, carved it into towers inspired by French châteaux. The cost crept towards $7 million. Average American workers earned less than $500 per year. The finished mansion was absurd in scale. Bowling alley, gymnasium, swimming pool, 3 elevators, private power plant, winter garden where tropical. Plants flourished while snow piled outside. At the heart stood a great hall with a pipe organ whose music rolled through every corridor. When Carnegie first visited, he looked up at the soaring ceilings and muttered, half stunned, "Now my house looks like a shack." It was meant as compliment. It carried the weight of prophecy. The Schwab mansion contained a flaw no marble could hide. It stood in the wrong place. Fifth Avenue society never fully accepted Charles Schwab. The whispers never stopped. Nouveau riche, steal money. Newspapers loved setting photographs of his palace beside stories about his gambling in Monte Carlo, the fast life that followed him continent to continent. His wife Emma walked those enormous halls and understood something her husband refused to accept. The house was too big for 2 people with no children. Staff numbered in the dozens, yet rooms felt hollow. Like a grand hotel that forgot to invite guests. For nearly 2 decades, Schwab tried filling that emptiness with people and music. Musicians performed in the Great Hall. Presidents and princes came. On winter evenings, the mansion blazed with light, glowing above Riverside Drive like a landlocked ocean liner moored in stone. Behind the spectacle, something rotted. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the steel industry staggered. Suddenly the man who could afford heating 75 rooms struggled paying property taxes. Schwab tried everything. He offered the mansion to the city as official mayoral residence. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia came in person, walked slowly through marble halls, delivered the verdict that sealed the building's fate. What, me live in that? In the Depression's depths, with millions struggling just to pay rent, a politician living in that kind of splendor was unthinkable. The city declined. No benefactor stepped forward. The palace stayed, but its future quietly vanished. Emma died in 1939. Charles, broken in health and fortune, moved to a modest apartment, never slept in his palace again. When he died later that year, debts exceeded assets. The man who once commanded billions left this world owing money. The mansion limped on without him, carved into apartments. Victory gardens sprouted where carriages once rolled. Then in 1948, the wrecking ball arrived. Today, walk that stretch between 73rd and 74th. You see nothing remarkable. Just an ordinary apartment building called Schwab House. Dogs tug at leashes. Joggers pass with headphones. Almost no one looks up. Almost no one imagines towers that once pierced this sky. The Schwab mansion was the largest private home ever built in New York City. It survived less than half a century. Its disappearance leaves a question hanging. What does it mean to build something so big the world cannot or will not contain it? Stand on the corner of 73rd and Riverside Drive. Hold a faded photograph from 1910. In the picture, a French château swallows the entire block. Towers, turrets, steep slate roofs catching pale morning sun. Look up from the photograph. Plain red brick apartment building, 15 stories of ordinary windows, doorman in grey uniform, woman walking a golden retriever, same corner, same coordinates, completely different world. This is what remains of Charles Schwab's dream. A name on an awning. Most residents have no idea why their building carries that title. They know nothing of the palace that stood here, parties that flooded these blocks with music, the Steel King who believed he could buy immortality in stone. The city erased him so thoroughly even his ghost would struggle finding its way home, yet ghosts leave traces. Walk south along Riverside Drive. Watch how lots change size. Most blocks hold several buildings, narrow pre-war apartments pressed together like books on crowded shelves. Between 73rd and 74th, only one structure. The footprint is wrong, too wide, too generous for Manhattan real. Estate math. This is scar tissue of Schwab's ambition. When developers cleared ruins in 1948, they inherited a plot so massive only a single enormous building could fill it. The proportions remember what architecture forgot. Step into Riverside Park across the street. Find a bench facing west. This is roughly where Schwab himself stood on summer evenings, watching sun slide behind New Jersey's Palisades. The view has hardly changed. Hudson still catches gold and copper light. Sailboats drift toward the harbour. He chose this site precisely for that vista. Proof that new money could claim the same horizons as old money. Could watch the same sunsets. Could feel the same river breeze. The irony cuts deep. Schwab chose Riverside Drive because Fifth Avenue society rejected him. If they wouldn't let him into their neighbourhood, he'd build something grander in his own. But the very act of building elsewhere froze his outsider status in stone. The mansion wasn't just triumph. It was confession. Pull out your phone, search historical photographs of the Schwab mansion, hold them against the modern skyline, the overlay haunts. Where joggers now pass, carriages once lined a curving driveway. Where the doorman stands, footmen in livery greeted senators and industrialists. The winter garden, that glass paradise of tropical plants, occupied roughly the spot where a first-floor fitness centre now hums with treadmills. Scale is hardest to grasp. We're used to large buildings in Manhattan, but Schwab's mansion wasn't a skyscraper. It spread outward like a European estate dropped onto an American grid. Contemporary accounts describe visitors approaching from Broadway and stopping mid-stride, unable to process what they were seeing. A chateau in Manhattan sprawling over more ground than many city parks. Neighbours must have felt something between awe and resentment. Imagine living in a modest brownstone, watching month after month as workers hauled pink granite up Riverside Drive, watching towers rise where rows of tenements might have stood, watching one man's ego quietly redraw the outline of your skyline. Yet the mansion also brought something the neighbourhood had never known: prestige. Property values along Riverside Drive climbed throughout the 1910s. Other wealthy families, encouraged by Schwab's example, began building their own grand homes nearby. For a brief golden moment, the wrong side of Central Park seemed ready to rival Fifth Avenue itself. That moment didn't last. The Depression crushed Riverside Drive's ambitions along with Schwab's fortune. Grand houses became boarding homes, elegant apartments were chopped into smaller units. The wealthy retreated to their traditional strongholds on the east side. Today, Riverside Drive is beautiful but not fashionable, quiet but not prestigious. The street has made peace with its history. Yet somewhere beneath the pavement, beneath Schwab House foundations, fragments of the original mansion may still lie hidden. Archaeologists have never opened the ground here. No one knows what wrecking crews buried when they cleared rubble, what carved stones, what shattered tiles, what remnants of a world that disappeared within a single generation. The ghost block keeps its secrets. But we don't need archaeology to understand what happened on this corner. We need only follow the money, follow the ambition, follow a young man from Pennsylvania coalfields as he climbs toward a fortune that will build an empire, then slowly devour it. Charles Schwab's story begins not in Manhattan, but in a small town called Loretto, and in the shadow of Andrew Carnegie, the Scotsman who would teach him everything about steel and nothing about restraint. Loretto, Pennsylvania. 1862. The town sits wedged into the Allegheny Mountains like a secret someone forgot to keep. The air doesn't just smell of coal, it tastes of it. Black dust settles on windowsills, on children's clothes, on the Sunday bread cooling on kitchen tables. The rivers run the colour of rust. The sky at noon looks like dusk somewhere else. This is where Charles Michael Schwab opens his eyes for the first time. February 18th. The first of 4 children. His father John works whatever jobs present themselves. Weaver first, then livery stable keeper. Respectable but never comfortable. The kind of work where one bad week means the family doesn't eat. One injury means they lose the roof. The Schwabs are Catholics surrounded by Protestants. German-speaking in an English world. Poor in an era when poverty isn't a temporary setback but a permanent address. Young Charles watches his father disappear before sunrise, return after dark, move through life hunched under invisible weight. He decides early. He will never be hunched. He will never be small. But something else is happening in western Pennsylvania that Charles can see from his bedroom window. The future is being forged literally. Blast furnaces. Light the night sky orange. Railroad tracks multiply across hillsides like iron veins. Men who were farmers 5 years ago now feed ore into machines that produce the bones of bridges, the skeletons of skyscrapers, the rails stitching America together. The Industrial Revolution isn't coming to Pennsylvania. It's already here, roaring and smoking and making certain men spectacularly rich. Charles is 17 when he walks into Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thompson Steelworks in Braddock. No connections, no formal training, just hunger and a smile that makes people forget they were supposed to say no. His first job is stake driver in the engineering department. $1 per day. The work is brutal, driving wooden stakes into ground to mark where foundations will go, where tracks will run, where the next expansion will rise. His hands blister, his back screams. He doesn't complain once. Because Schwab possesses something rarer than skill. 2 things, actually. He can do complex mathematics in his head faster than most men can do it on paper, and he can talk to anyone, foreman or labourer, executive or janitor, with warmth that makes each person feel genuinely seen. Carnegie notices, the Scottish immigrant who would become America's richest man has a genius for spotting talent. He sees in this smooth-talking kid from Loretto something uncomfortably familiar. Hunger that refuses satisfaction, ambition that treats obstacles as invitations. Within 6 months, Schwab moves fully into engineering. Within 2 years, he's superintendent. By age 25, he's running the entire Homestead Steel Works, one of the largest, most profitable steel plants on Earth. The speed is absurd. Men twice his age with decades more experience suddenly report to this kid. Some hate him for it. Most can't help admiring the drive. Schwab arrives before dawn, leaves after midnight. He memorizes workers' wives' names, remembers their children's birthdays. When company rewards feel stingy, he pulls cash from his own pocket for bonuses. This isn't manipulation. Or rather, it's manipulation so sincere it stops feeling like manipulation. Schwab genuinely likes people. Their stories interest him. Their problems feel worth solving. In an industry where strikes are broken with bullets, where union organizers vanish without trial, Schwab represents something rare. A boss workers don't despise. Carnegie loves him for it. The older man built his empire through efficiency and ruthlessness. But steel is ultimately made by human beings. Human beings work harder for leaders they trust. In Schwab, Carnegie finds someone who can extract maximum productivity without inspiring maximum resentment. By 1897, Schwab becomes president of Carnegie Steel. He's 35 years old. The position makes him wealthy beyond anything his father dreamed possible. But wealth for Schwab is never the end point. Money is proof. Proof he escaped poverty. Proof his name matters. Proof the hunched boy from coal country became someone who couldn't be ignored. The problem with proof? It never feels sufficient. Every milestone demands a larger one. Every success whispers that failure remains possible. The hunger that lifted him from stake driver to steel baron now feeds on itself, growing sharper with each achievement. Carnegie understands this demon. He carries the same one. But Carnegie knows when to stop. In 1901, he sells his steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, the largest business transaction in history. He spends his remaining years racing to give it away. Libraries, universities, concert halls, dying as close to poor as a millionaire can manage. Schwab draws the opposite lesson. He watches Carnegie's mansions rise in Manhattan and Scotland, attends parties where guest lists read like a census of American power, and decides he'll build something grander still. Not to donate, to keep. A monument to himself, a palace that will announce in stone and slate and glass that Charles Schwab from Loretto, Pennsylvania has arrived. The land on Riverside Drive waits. Architects stand ready. The only real question is whether a fortune forged in steel can support a dream poured entirely from pride. The answer begins taking shape in 1901. Schwab stands on an empty lot stretching from 73rd to 74th Street, watching the Hudson shimmer in autumn light. Behind him lies Central Park. Beyond its trees, the limestone palaces of Fifth Avenue where Vanderbilts and Astors hold court. They haven't truly invited him in. Not the way that matters. He's still steel money, still new, still not quite acceptable, so he'll build his own world here on the wrong side of the park. The land carries history Schwab doesn't advertise. It once housed an orphan asylum, grim institutional block where homeless children slept in rows beneath bare ceilings. When the asylum relocated, the structure came down. The ground sat vacant, burdened more than prized. Schwab sees opportunity. He pays approximately $865,000 for the entire block, then shops for an architect. His choice startles New York's establishment. Instead of hiring celebrated firms like McKim, Mead & White, Schwab selects Maurice Heber, talented but relatively unknown designer trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The decision is deliberate. Schwab wants someone who'll execute his vision, not fight him with their own. He wants control over every line. The instructions are simple and ruthless. Study the great château of France's Loire Valley, Chenonceau, Chambord, Azay-le-Rideau. Fuse their finest elements into something unprecedented. Something that makes every mansion on Fifth Avenue look modest by comparison. Heber delivers. Construction begins in 1902. 4 years of transformation. At peak, the project employs over 600 workers, stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from Germany, iron workers drawn from across the eastern seaboard. They arrive before dawn, climb scaffolding that scrapes clouds, spend days turning raw stone and timber into one man's fantasy. The numbers bend belief. 75 rooms, 40 bathrooms, basement holding bowling alley, gymnasium, swimming pool lined with hand-painted Italian tiles. 3 elevators, mechanical marvels when most New Yorkers still trust legs over cables. Private electrical plant so lights never depend on the city's unreliable grid. And in the Great Hall, a pipe organ whose music can spill onto Riverside Drive when tall windows stand open. Everywhere, details whisper European aristocracy. Carved limestone facades, steep slate roofs imported from France, towers rising roughly 75 feet, sweeping porte cochere where carriages deposit guests beneath marble entrance hall, sheltered from wind and rain. Wrought iron gates bearing the Schwab family crest, a crest Charles commissioned specifically for this house, since his family never possessed ancestral arms. Here's the paradox. Schwab wants a mansion that looks centuries old, a château implying generations of inherited wealth. Yet every stone shouts the opposite. This is new money straining to appear ancient. The house is costume. Everyone in New York society understands the role it's trying to play. The workers don't lose sleep over symbolism. They care about wages, safety, daily grind of raising a palace from Manhattan bedrock. Contemporary accounts say almost nothing about their lives. History rarely remembers names of those who build monuments for others. But we can picture their days. Granite blocks biting into gloved hands, dust clinging to lungs, sharp wind on scaffolding high above Riverside Drive, constant risk that one misstep turns a workday into disaster. Some likely lived in Lower East Side tenements, rooms smaller than Schwab's planned closets. Each morning they crossed the city to the Upper West Side, built luxury they'd never inhabit, returned at night to apartments without running water or proper heat. This was Gilded Age arithmetic. Some men dreamed in marble, other men made those dreams solid for about $1 a day. By 1906, the mansion stands complete. Final cost, $6 to $7 million. Newspapers print the figures repeatedly, mixing awe with disapproval. For that sum, the city could have built dozens of schools or hundreds of affordable housing units. Instead, the money produced one private residence for one man, his wife, and their household staff. The opening was not so much a party as a procession. New York's elite arrived one after another to see what Schwab had conjured from stone and steel, to decide whether he had finally bought his way into their ranks. They crossed the threshold into the marble entrance hall, climbed the grand staircase beneath chandeliers, paused in the winter garden where tropical plants bloomed year-round in carefully managed warmth, while snow fell quietly outside, and they whispered. Inside, the scale did the real talking. The entrance hall alone could have swallowed a modest brownstone. Marble floors mirrored the glow from crystal fixtures imported from Vienna. The grand staircase swept upward in a curve so precise it felt almost weightless, each balustrade carved with acanthus leaves and cherubs. Guests climbed toward the second floor and stepped into a gallery lined with paintings. Old masters Schwab had hunted down at auctions across Europe, their gilt frames blazing against walls covered in silk damask. But the true spectacle waited in the great hall. This was the heart of the mansion, a room designed not for comfort, but for awe. Soaring ceilings disappeared into shadow. At one end stood the pipe organ, more than 2,000 pipes hidden behind carved wooden screens, capable of filling the space with sound closer to a cathedral than a private home. Schwab had hired organists to perform during dinner parties, the music swelling between courses, turning meals into something like services in a church of money. On that first evening, the organ played Handel. Guests sipped champagne and drifted through rooms that seemed to multiply without end. A library panelled in rare woods, a billiard room with tables imported from England, a winter garden where palm trees and orchids flourished beneath a glass ceiling. Servants in formal livery appeared and vanished through hidden doors, balancing silver trays, refilling glasses, adjusting details before anyone had to ask. Charles Schwab moved through his house like a conductor directing an orchestra. He greeted every guest by name, recalled details from past conversations, made introductions that flattered both sides. His wife Emma stayed closer to the edges, quieter, watching. She smiled when expected, said the right things at the right moments. But those who knew her saw something guarded in her face. Not pure pride, not open discomfort, something closer to waiting, as if she expected a cost that hadn't yet been presented. Andrew Carnegie arrived late, as befitted his status. The old Scotsman was 70 now, retired from business, already deep into his campaign to give away his fortune before death. He walked slowly through the entrance hall, paused at the foot of the grand staircase and looked up. The silence stretched. Then Carnegie turned to his former protégé and delivered the verdict that would echo through New York drawing rooms for years. "Charlie, now my house looks like a shack." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Schwab beamed. On the surface, pure praise. Proof that the student had surpassed the master, at least when it came to square footage and spectacle. But under the joke sat something sharper. Carnegie had built his fortune through discipline and restraint. He lived well, but he also gave relentlessly. His mansions were large, yet many of his buildings were meant for others. Libraries for the public, halls for music, spaces for philanthropy. Schwab's château served only Schwab. The newspapers noticed. Reviews of the mansion mixed admiration with unease. One columnist called the house the most magnificent private residence in America, and in the same breath wondered whether such magnificence was decent in an age when thousands sleep in tenements. Another praised the craftsmanship but questioned the taste. Too French, too theatrical, too obviously built to impress. Schwab brushed off the criticism. He'd created exactly what he wanted. The parties rolled on through that first season and into the next. Opera singers performed in the Great Hall. Politicians angled for invitations. Industrialists toured the grounds and went back to their own homes feeling slightly uncomfortably outdone. But Emma Schwab saw what her husband did not. The rooms were too large for two people. Their footsteps echoed in corridors designed for crowds. They had no children to fill the nursery. No heirs waiting to claim the paintings and silver. The staff outnumbered the family by a ratio that bordered on absurd. Dozens of servants maintaining a house for a couple who spent half their lives on trains and steamships. At night, when the guests had gone and the organ stopped, Emma walked through the empty halls and tried to name what they'd built. A home, a monument, a trap. She never voiced these doubts to Charles. He was too thrilled, too proud, too convinced that the mansion proved everything he'd set out to prove. But the question lingered in the air like dust in the winter garden, settling slowly on every surface. By 1910, the Schwab mansion had settled into a rhythm. Not the rhythm of a home, but of an institution. Each morning began before dawn in the basement kitchen where a team of cooks prepared breakfast for the household. Coffee percolated in silver urns. Eggs arrived from a farm upstate, delivered by a supplier who served only the wealthiest families. Bread came from a private baker. Fruit arrived from greenhouses that stayed warm and bright through New York winters. The staff numbered between 40 and 50, depending on the season. Housekeepers dusted rooms no one entered for weeks. Footmen polished silver that sat untouched in cabinets between parties. Groundskeepers tended lawns and gardens that only the Schwabs and their servants ever really saw. A private secretary managed Charles's constant stream of letters and telegrams. A social secretary curated Emma's calendar. An engineer watched over the private electrical plant. A chauffeur waited beside the automobiles that had replaced the carriages of earlier years. This small army moved through the mansion via a hidden skeleton of corridors and staircases. Service passages designed to keep servants invisible. The architecture itself enforced a hierarchy. The Schwabs lived in the grand rooms with views of the Hudson, while the people who made their lives possible existed in the walls and shadows, emerging only when summoned. Emma treated the staff well. Contemporary accounts describe her as kind, even generous. She remembered birthdays, asked after families, arranged medical care when employees fell ill. But kindness couldn't erase how strange the arrangement was. She was a woman from a modest Pennsylvania background, now presiding over a household larger than some hotels. The role never sat entirely right on her shoulders. She filled her days with the expected duties of a Gilded Age wife, charity committees, luncheons with other society women, visits to galleries and concert halls. She redecorated rooms that didn't need redecorating, ordered flowers that wilted before anyone truly enjoyed them, planned elaborate menus for dinners Charles often missed because work held him at the office, or business trips pulled him overseas. For long stretches, the mansion, for all its grandeur, was empty of the man who had built it. Charles Schwab hadn't created a home to live quietly in. He'd built a stage. When guests filled the great hall, when the organ shook the walls and champagne sparkled in crystal, the château made sense. It justified itself through spectacle. But spectacle needs an audience, and audiences always go home. In the long afternoons and early mornings, stripped of music and conversation, the mansion showed its true nature. It felt less like shelter and more like a monument, a stone proof of ambition, not a place designed for ordinary human life. Schwab himself seemed allergic to stillness. He travelled constantly, to Europe for business and pleasure, to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where his steel company operated, to Washington, where he courted political connections. When he was home, he worked. When he wasn't working, he entertained. The idea of simply being in his own house, reading by the fire, walking the grounds with Emma, hardly fit his character at all. Emma adapted. She carved out a smaller world inside the larger one, a suite of rooms on the upper floors, where she could live at a human scale. She built routines that didn't depend on her husband's presence. She found comfort in a small circle of friends who visited regularly, women who understood that wealth didn't guarantee happiness, and who never made her feel foolish for expressing doubts. The doubts, however, stayed. The couple had no children. Whether by choice or by circumstance, the record is silent, but the absence shaped everything. The nursery on the third floor stood fully furnished and unused, a string of rooms planned for a future dynasty. Children's bedrooms, a schoolroom, a playroom, had no function. Emma sometimes walked through these spaces, running her hand along the backs of empty chairs, imagining the voices that never came. Charles didn't talk about it. He pointed his paternal energy outward instead, toward his employees. At Bethlehem Steel, he played the role of benevolent father to thousands of workers. He gave speeches about loyalty and family, handed out turkeys at Christmas, funded scholarships for workers' children. The company became the dynasty the mansion could never house. And so the years passed. The mansion hosted presidents. William Howard Taft visited, and later Warren Harding. Musicians performed in the Great Hall. Charity galas raised fortunes for hospitals and orphanages. The Schwab name appeared regularly in the society pages, always paired with words like elegance, generosity and taste. But behind the photographs and polished descriptions, the reality remained simpler and sadder. Two people moving through 75 rooms, each in their own quiet way, wondering whether any of it had been worth the price. The casinos of Monte Carlo knew Charles Schwab by name. Each winter he arrived like clockwork, crossing Europe in private railroad cars with enough cash to shake a government treasury. At the gaming tables, dealers greeted him with the deference saved for men who could lose fortunes without flinching. And Schwab, brilliant as he was in business, couldn't resist the wheel's spin. His gambling wasn't secret. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported his Monte Carlo visits with equal parts fascination and moral outrage. In 1902, Andrew Carnegie publicly rebuked his former protégé after especially spectacular losses surfaced. Schwab apologized, promised reform, then returned to the same tables the next season. The cycle repeated for decades. But roulette was only the most visible symptom. Schwab lived fast because stillness frightened him. He worked 18-hour days, then sought pleasures intense enough to drown the noise in his head. Fine wines, multi-course dinners at Europe's best restaurants. The company of beautiful women who weren't his wife. Rumours followed him across continents, whispers of affairs, apartments quietly rented for mistresses, a second life unfolding far from Riverside Drive. Emma heard the whispers. Impossible not to in New York society where gossip was currency and her husband's behaviour supplied endless material. Yet she never confronted him publicly, never threatened divorce, never staged the dramatic scenes that would have thrilled tabloids. Whether that silence was dignity, denial, or exhaustion, the record doesn't say. She remained in the mansion, managing the household, attending necessary social events, playing the loyal wife while her husband played different roles elsewhere. The gap between public image and private reality widened with every passing year. In speeches and interviews, Schwab presented himself as devoted family man and benevolent captain of industry, a leader who valued loyalty above all. He called his workers his boys, his company his family, his mansion proof that the American dream rewarded hard work and moral living. The hypocrisy was staggering. But in the Gilded Age, selective truth-telling was practically job description. His business choices began mirroring the recklessness that ruled his personal life. At Bethlehem Steel, Schwab made bold bets that sometimes paid spectacularly and sometimes nearly sank the company. He expanded capacity based on optimistic forecasts that didn't always materialize. He clashed with cautious board members urging restraint. He poured company money into projects serving his ego more than the bottom line, including a failed plan to build the world's largest office building. The pattern was clear. Schwab struggled distinguishing confidence from overconfidence. The same conviction that propelled him from stake driver to steel baron now blinded him to dangers more cautious men saw plainly. He'd gambled from poverty to vast wealth and couldn't stop gambling, even when stakes involved thousands of jobs and his empire's survival. World War I briefly turned his addiction to risk into advantage. Bethlehem Steel won enormous contracts, supplying Allied powers with munitions, ships, armour plate. Profits exploded, Schwab's personal fortune already, burned through once by extravagance, swelled again to dizzying levels. He was hailed as patriot, hero of the industrial front, the man whose steel helped defeat the Kaiser. For a moment, the mansion on Riverside Drive found new script. Victory parties celebrated the armistice. Generals, diplomats, industrialists climbed the grand staircase to toast war's end. Schwab stood in the great hall receiving their praise, and briefly it seemed his habit of always doubling down had been vindicated forever. But luck isn't a business plan. The 1920s, for all their glitter, quietly set the stage for reckoning that would reach everyone. Schwab spent that decade exactly as he'd spent previous ones, travelling, entertaining, gambling, working. The music inside the mansion changed. Jazz orchestras replaced old string quartets. Prohibition turned alcohol into contraband. But to a man with Schwab's connections, law was nuisance more than barrier. Champagne arrived through private channels. Whiskey flowed in crystal decanters as if the Volstead Act didn't exist. The stock market climbed. Schwab's paper wealth climbed with it. He was 60, then 65, still energetic, still convinced the party would never end. Emma watched from her private rooms on the upper floors. She was older now, quieter, her health beginning to fail. The mansion that once felt merely too large now resembled a mausoleum. Magnificent, cold, waiting for its story to turn. She spent more time alone, reading, writing letters to old friends, remembering the small Pennsylvania towns where she and Charles started together before steel and stone and chandeliers. She couldn't have known what was coming. None of them could. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday on Wall Street. Panic swallowed the trading floor. Men who'd been millionaires at breakfast found themselves ruined by lunch. Stocks that climbed for years collapsed in hours. Ticker machines couldn't keep up. Prices fell faster than paper tape could print them. Outside the New York Stock Exchange, crowds gathered in near silence, watching their futures vanish behind tall windows. On Riverside Drive, the Schwab mansion stood quiet. No parties that week, no organ music drifting through the great hall. Charles Schwab was 67 and understood immediately what younger men refused to accept. This wasn't a correction. This was an ending. The crash didn't obliterate him overnight. Unlike speculators who'd borrowed to buy stocks, Schwab held most wealth in Bethlehem steel. Real assets, real factories, real machines. But steel is only valuable when someone needs it. In months after Black Tuesday, demand for steel thinned to almost nothing. Construction projects froze across America. Railroads cancelled plans for new track. Automobile manufacturers slashed production. Skyscrapers that had been climbing over Manhattan and Chicago, monuments to the same optimism that built Schwab's château, stopped mid-rise, their steel skeletons left bare against winter skies. Bethlehem Steel's stock price, once peaked above $140 per share, began a long slide that would eventually scrape bottom in single digits. On paper, Schwab watched his fortune dissolve. Paper losses turned real when bills arrived. The mansion devoured money. Property taxes alone exceeded $50,000 yearly, enough to buy several comfortable houses outright. Staff needed salaries regardless of Wall Street. The heating system burned through coal by the ton. Maintenance on a building this size never ended. Roof tiles cracked, pipes corroded, carved stone weathered and demanded repair. Even the gardens insisted on constant spending. Teams of workers tending lawns and flower beds that now felt like obscene luxuries. Schwab started selling. First the paintings, old masters auctioned quietly so their absence wouldn't become headlines. Then the automobiles, then pieces of silver and furniture Emma had spent decades choosing. Each sale bought a little time. None solved the problem. The mansion remained vast and hungry, consuming cash faster than Schwab could turn objects into money. He tried borrowing. Banks that once competed for his signature now demanded collateral he no longer had. His reputation, which survived gambling stories and whispered affairs, couldn't survive simple arithmetic of insolvency. Charles Schwab, the boy from Williamsburg who became president of United States Steel and later Titan of Bethlehem, was running out of cash. The staff noticed first. Salaries arrived late, then later, then stopped entirely for some positions. Senior servants who'd spent decades in the house quietly looked for work elsewhere. The army of roughly 40 shrank to 30, then 20, then fewer still. Rooms that gleamed under daily polishing gathered dust. The winter garden, starved of proper heat, lost its tropical plants one frost at a time. Emma's health declined with the household. She was around 70 now, worn down by years of managing a home that never fully felt like hers. Doctors visited more often. Nurses were hired, then dismissed when money ran short. She spent most time in the small private suite she'd carved out years earlier, the cluster of rooms where life still felt human-sized. Charles tried keeping up appearances. He still dressed impeccably, still attended social functions that would have him, still gave speeches about American resilience and certainty of recovery. But those who knew him saw the strain under performance. His famous charm felt forced. His optimism rang thin. The man who once commanded every room he entered now seemed to be asking those rooms for permission to stay. The lowest moment came in 1933. Desperate to cut his tax burden, Schwab offered the mansion to New York City as official residence for the mayor. It was humiliating reversal, the palace built to prove. He'd arrived now dangled as gift simply to escape its cost. He framed the proposal as civic generosity, a donation to the people of New York. Everyone understood the reality. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia came to see for himself. He walked through marble halls, inspected the pipe organ, stood in the winter garden where dead plants still filled their beds. Then he gave his verdict. What, me and that? The rejection was total. LaGuardia knew accepting such a gift would be political suicide. With millions of New Yorkers unemployed, hungry, losing their homes, no elected official could move into a 75-room château without inviting rage. The mansion had become unsellable, ungiftable, unloved. Emma's death changed something in Schwab that money couldn't fix. The apartment on Park Avenue became his prison. Small rooms, borrowed furniture, the opposite of everything he'd built. Friends visited and found him diminished. The charm that once filled ballrooms now flickered weakly across a kitchen table. He repeated stories, forgot names, lost track of conversations mid-sentence. The Steel King was rusting from the inside out. September 18th, 1939, 5 months after Emma. Charles Schwab died in that modest apartment, surrounded by nothing that resembled the life he'd constructed. No marble halls, no pipe organ, no servants waiting in hidden corridors, just a nurse, a doctor, and the quiet end that comes for everyone regardless of how many towers they've built. The obituaries praised his rise from Pennsylvania coal country. They mentioned his role in American steel, his wartime contributions, his famous mansion. But they were careful. They didn't linger on Monte Carlo or the mistresses or the slow collapse of his finances. Death had granted him a dignity life never quite allowed. Then the lawyers opened his books. Charles M. Schwab, who'd once controlled hundreds of millions, who'd built the largest private home in New York, who'd lived, like European royalty, died owing more than he owned. The exact figure varied by source. Some said 300,000, others claimed higher. The details didn't matter. The Steel King left this world bankrupt. The mansion sat empty through 1940, 41, 42. War came. Young men shipped overseas. Rationing began. New York transformed itself again, and the château on Riverside Drive became increasingly absurd. 75 rooms sitting vacant while families doubled up in cramped apartments. A swimming pool gathering dust while children played in hydrant spray on summer streets. A winter garden full of dead plants, while victory gardens sprouted in parks. Someone saw opportunity in all that empty space. By 1943, new owners had acquired the property for almost nothing. Their plan was simple and brutal. Subdivide. Carve the palace into apartments. Turn one man's monument into housing for dozens of families who needed roofs more than they needed. Chandeliers. The work began without ceremony. Walls went up where no architect had planned them. The Great Hall, designed for presidential receptions, got chopped into 6 separate units. Workers ran plumbing through former dressing rooms. They installed kitchenettes in spaces that once held art collections. They partitioned the winter garden into cramped studios that kept none of its glass ceiling splendor. Every hammer blow erased another piece of Schwab's vision. The new tenants arrived with suitcases and children. Teachers, clerks, young couples starting out, war widows stretching small pensions. They climbed the grand staircase Vanderbilts had once ascended, but now they climbed to reach third-floor walk-ups with shared bathrooms. The irony cut deep. Schwab had built his chateau to escape poverty, to prove a Pennsylvania boy could live like nobility. Now his monument housed people not so different from his own parents. Working families for whom a roof and 4 walls counted as triumph. The mansion had completed a circle its creator never imagined. Life inside the converted palace felt strange but functional. Residents told stories of footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening on their own, cold spots in rooms that should have been warm. Whether these were ghosts or just the groans of an aging building full of hidden shafts, nobody knew. But the stories spread, giving the place a new legend to replace the old one. The grounds changed too. Lawns that teams of gardeners once maintained now sprouted victory gardens. Tomatoes and beans planted by residents doing their wartime part. Laundry lines stretched where carriages had rolled. Children played tag on terraces originally designed for champagne receptions. A monument to excess had become a monument to necessity. Preservationists protested. They wrote letters, petitioned officials, begged someone to intervene. The Schwab mansion was irreplaceable Beaux-Arts architecture, they argued. It deserved protection. Regardless of its owner's story, almost nobody listened. New York in the 1940s had no patience for nostalgia. The city was growing, shifting, hauling itself toward a post-war boom everyone felt coming. Old buildings were obstacles, not heirlooms. The Schwab mansion, tied in public memory to Gilded Age excess and financial collapse, felt especially dated. It stood for exactly what the new America wanted to bury. By 1947, the investors who'd carved up the mansion reached their conclusion. The building wasn't worth saving. The land beneath it, an entire city block in Manhattan, was worth far more than any aging structure sitting on top of it. The decision happened in boardrooms. No public vote, no hearings. One day residents received notices under their doors. Find new homes. The building will be demolished. Something bigger will rise in its place. Most New Yorkers shrugged. They'd never loved the Schwab mansion. Many had never forgiven what it symbolized. If the wrecking ball wanted to erase this particular reminder of inequality, who were they to object? The evacuation took months. Families boxed their lives and scattered. Victory gardens withered. Laundry lines came down. Room by room, floor by floor, the mansion emptied until only echo remained. January 1948. A cold morning. The wrecking ball arrived on Riverside Drive. A young demolition worker, 23 years old, entered through the servants' entrance before the destruction began. His foreman sent him to survey for hazards. He stepped into oak-panelled corridors still catching faint light through grimy windows. The scale stopped him cold. He walked through a kitchen built like a factory, climbed a marble staircase wider than his entire apartment, stood in the great hall where the pipe organ still waited, too complicated for anyone to move quickly. Everywhere he looked, grandeur collided with ruin. In a servant's quarters on the 4th floor, he found initials scratched into plaster beside a window, JM 1904. A construction worker from the original crew had left his mark 44 years earlier. The young man took out his pocket knife. He hesitated. Then carved his own initials beside the old ones. 2 anonymous labourers separated by half a century, joined by a gesture nobody else would notice. On his way out, he pocketed a brass doorknob shaped like a lion's head. Proof that this place had been real. That beauty on this scale had actually stood in stone and wood, even if it couldn't last. The wrecking ball swung. Each impact sent stone dust billowing across Riverside Drive. Each crash tore away another tower, another room that had cost more to build than most families would earn in lifetimes. The workers kept professional distance, but some paused between swings. They understood they were erasing something that would never be built again. By spring, only rubble remained. Trucks hauled away the last fragments of pink granite and carved limestone. The lot lay bare for the first time in half a century. Then construction began on what would replace it. Schwab House rose with post-war efficiency. 15 stories of red brick and functional windows. 620 apartments, each compact and practical. Maximum units, minimum waste. Rents within reach of middle-class families who needed space more than spectacle. The first residents arrived in 1950. They signed leases without knowing what stood there before. Schwab House was just an address, a place to receive mail and tell taxi drivers. Older neighbours tried explaining. They showed yellowing photographs of the mansion. The young families smiled, nodded, went back to unpacking. Memory thinned with surprising speed. Within a decade, the Schwab mansion became rumour. Within 2 decades, even the rumour blurred. The few surviving photographs showed something that looked more like a Loire Valley castle than anything people believed could have existed in Manhattan. But the land remembered. The footprint of Schwab House matched exactly the footprint of Schwab's mansion. Same boundaries, same proportions. An entire city block given to a single building. A quiet anomaly in Manhattan's grid of narrow lots and shared walls. Inside Schwab House, new stories took root. Children grew up in apartments their grandparents first rented. Friendships formed in elevators. A community emerged that had nothing to do with Charles Schwab, nothing to do with the Gilded Age, nothing to do with the mansion their building replaced. This was the purest erasure. Not just destruction, but replacement. The château had been removed so completely that its successor could become ordinary. Just another apartment house on a street lined with apartment houses. Today you can stand on that corner with photographs from 1910. Hold them up against the modern skyline. The overlay is haunting. Where joggers pass, carriages once lined. Driveways. Where a doorman stands, footmen greeted senators. The winter garden occupied roughly the spot where a fitness centre now hums with treadmills. What does the Schwab mansion teach us? The obvious lesson is about hubris. Schwab built a palace to prove he'd won. But the victory monument became a cage. The larger the château grew, the smaller its owner seemed inside it. There's another lesson, though, quieter, sharper. Schwab believed stone could lock meaning in place. If he built something grand enough, he'd matter forever. He trusted walls and marble more than how people would tell his story. He was wrong. The mansion lasted 42 years. The stone that was supposed to outlast generations became landfill before his generation fully passed. What survived wasn't architecture, it was narrative. We're talking about this house now because Schwab's collapse proved more gripping than his climb. The mansion exists now only as story, carried from researcher to writer to viewer. Rebuilt not in stone, but imagination. Maybe that's the only immortality anyone gets. Charles Schwab wanted to be remembered as the man who built something permanent. Instead, he's remembered as the man who built something that disappeared. And in disappearing, left behind a question hanging over every fortune, every monument, every attempt to buy legacy in stone. What remains when the stone is gone? The answer sits on that corner between 73rd and 74th. Not in the brick, not in the doorman checking his phone, in the absence itself. Schwab spent $7 million proving he belonged. The city spent 42 years proving he didn't. But here's what neither side understood. Belonging was never the point. The mansion wasn't built for acceptance. It was built against rejection. Every tower, every marble step, every pipe in that organ was Schwab screaming at Fifth Avenue society. You can't ignore me now. They did anyway, not by refusing to look, by looking, then shrugging, then forgetting. That's the real cruelty of erasure, not violence but indifference. Walk Riverside Drive today and you'll see joggers who've never heard the name Charles Schwab. Families who think Schwab House refers to the financial company. Children playing where a steel king once tried building eternity out of pink granite and wounded pride. The mansion taught New York something it already suspected. Stone doesn't make you immortal. Story does. But you don't get to write your own story. You build the monument. Other people decide what it means. Schwab wanted his chateau to whisper, "Look what a poor boy from Pennsylvania accomplished." Instead it screamed, "Look how desperately he needed you to notice." That desperation survived the wrecking ball. It survived the replacement building. It survived 75 years of forgetting. Because we're still here, standing on this corner, holding faded photographs up to empty sky, trying to understand what possessed a man to build something this large, this expensive, this doomed from the moment the first stone was laid. The answer isn't in the architecture, it's in the arithmetic. Schwab died owing money, not because he spent it all, because he spent it on the wrong things, on proof instead of purpose, on showing instead of being, on a house that couldn't love him back. Emma knew. She walked those 75 rooms understanding they'd never be home, just theatre where her husband performed for an audience that never arrived. She died there anyway, loyal to the end, buried in marble that outlasted her by 9 years. The mansion's gone, but its question remains. Not what remains when stone is gone. What remains when the hunger that built it never gets fed. When the proof you're chasing keeps demanding more proof. When the monument you raise to yourself becomes the headstone marking where you died inside. Charles Schwab from Loretto, Pennsylvania. Stake driver to steel baron to bankrupt. The largest private home in New York City. 42 years. Then rubble. Then ordinary brick. Then this. A name on an awning most people can't explain. That's not tragedy. That's just what happens when you confuse building with becoming. When you think arrival means you can finally stop running. When you pour everything into stone and discover too late that stone doesn't remember, doesn't care, just sits there waiting for the wrecking ball that always, eventually comes. The lot is bare now in the only way that matters. Not of buildings, of illusions. The chateau proved nothing except that you can't buy your way past the thing eating you from inside. That hunger follows you into every room of every palace you'll ever build. That the boy from coal country never left. He just got richer, louder, more desperate, and in the end, smaller.